The history and mysteries of Peru. And there will be quite a few mysteries that we cover along the way. After a meal in Peru, there are general after dinner conversations. They're drawn out after dinner conversations. Sometimes we do this here in the US, but in Peru, it rises to an entirely new level. The conversations go on long after dessert is finished. Cups of coffee refilled, after dinner drinks are served. Sometimes the restaurant even closes or someone falls asleep at the table. But the conversation just keeps on going. These conversations actually have a name in Spanish. It's called sobremesa, meaning on the table. The food is gone, but the conversation is still on the table. It was just a few years ago at a sobremesa, the conversation was about Peru's history, and someone said, "En el Perú, el pasado es el presente," which means in Peru, the past is the present. My first reaction to this statement was, that sounds really profound. It means the past is part of today's soul in everyday Peru. And it's like the French saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Sometimes we say in the US, well, history just keeps on repeating itself. It's kind of the same there in Peru. Now, in this course, when we discuss history and dates, we will be using the updated terms like BCE, before Common Era, CE, Common Era, and BP, meaning before present. What will we cover in the history and mysteries of Peru? Well, these are the sections that we'll cover. I've sent these to you previously in the course outline. Now, I'm not a historian, not an archaeologist, so I'm not an expert on any of this, but I like to learn about history because if we don't, we are condemned to repeat it. So with that, just like Beetlejuice, it's showtime for the history and mysteries of Peru. The next section is if I could turn back time. Now, this is not a tribute to Cher because we are going to be digging about potatoes, mummies, and fanged idols. Peru's history goes 14,000 years to Huaca Prieta near Trujillo on the north coast. By the way, Huaca can mean a shrine, a religious pilgrimage site, or an archaeological ruin. Huaqueros is the Spanish term for a tomb raider or grave robber. This has happened a lot in Peru with the Peruvian relics. Tom Dillahay is a well-known archaeologist. In 2016, he found evidence of human settlement here at Huaca Prieta. This included stone tools, animal bones, and hearth fires. These were radiocarbon dated to 14,400 years BP. This is some of the oldest verified evidence of any human activity anywhere in the Americas. It's much older than the Clovis site in New Mexico. Dillahay found whole corn cobs and corn stalks, the earliest corn ever found in South America, dating to 6,700 BP. Dillahay also found kernels of your favorite movie-watching treat, popcorn. Avocados were domesticated 4,500 years ago BP here. Huaca Prieta also had indigo-dyed cotton fabric, the earliest dyed cloth in the world, dating to 6,000 years ago, 1,500 years before Egypt. Around 10,500 BP in northern Peru, the first domesticated plants in the Western Hemisphere came about, peppers and gourds. Shortly afterwards came squash and peanuts. In the Amazon, the cassava tuber, also called manioc or yucca, is used to make tapioca, was domesticated. Then in the jungle highlands, coca plants. Around 10,000 years ago in the southern Andes, early Peruvians domesticated a toxic nightshade weed that grew from a tuber. It became the food that changed the world, the potato. There are over 3,000 varieties of potato in Peru. It is the fourth most cultivated crop in the world after wheat, rice, and corn. Early Peruvians domesticated two types of the native camelids. First, the llamas. I'm going to mention that I am pronouncing this as it is in Spanish. The double L is pronounced like a Y in English, so it's llama, not llama. If you say llama, some Peruvians might get confused and think you're talking about that guy in Tibet, the Dalai Lama. Then came the alpacas with softer, fluffier wool. There's two other camelid species, Vicuña and Guanaco, that remain wild. Now here I have a souvenir from Peru. This is a representation of an alpaca with very, very nice fluffy wool. You can get these at any artisan market. Another mammal domesticated for food and ketchup was called cuy, and in Spanish, cuy in singular and cuyes in plural. In English, these are known as guinea pigs, although they do not come from Guinea, and they are rodents, not pigs. In the south of Peru, near the city of Tacna, the Chinchorro culture created mummies of their dead over 7,000 years ago. These were the world's first mummies. Over 1,500 mummies were found here in the Atacama Desert, which is one of the driest places on Earth. The Chinchorro people removed the body's internal organs. The body was stuffed with wool, grass, and seashells. Then it was all put back together. Then they put on a clay mask to cover up the faces, sometimes molding them into really some odd facial expressions, and some of these really look a little bit frightening. On the preserved skin of these mummies, there was some of the world's first tattoos. Unlike most later groups, the Chinchorro were equal opportunity mummifiers. There were mummies of all ages, sex, and social status. They invented mummification for the first time, not just in South America, but anywhere in the world. It was 2,000 years earlier than the earliest Egyptian mummies. For the next 7,000 years in Peru, up through the Incas, the people honored their dead with mummies. Norte Chico is a group of river valleys in the desert about 120 miles north of Lima. This area was first settled around 11,000 years ago. In the Norte Chico river valleys, there were 30 early urban settlements of complex societies that you can see here in this map. The population here was well over 10,000. The oldest dated of the urban areas is Huaricanga in the Fortaleza River Valley. It was excavated in 2007 and dates from 5,500 years ago. Huaricanga has a large platform mound and has two large sacred monoliths nearby. Carausupe was the largest of the cities and was the administrative center and capital of Norte Chico. Carausupe is just a few miles away from Huaricanga. In 2004, Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shadi Solis announced that Carausupe was reliably dated to 5200 BP, making it the oldest city in the Americas. Carausupe has monumental architecture, earthwork platform mounds, and a sunken circular plaza, all made of quarried stone. The largest platform mound is a huge base of 520 feet by 490 feet, and it's a total 59 feet high. Carausupe existed at the same time period as the ancient Sumerian cities in Mesopotamia, and it was built 1,000 years before the building of the pyramids of Egypt and 1,000 years before civilization began in the Indus Valley of India. Here's a depiction of the construction and building of Carausupe. Carausupe shows no evidence of warfare, and there were no defensive fortifications at all. There was sharing of traded resources, suggesting a peaceful relationship with cooperation between the neighboring groups. A collection of flutes carved with faces was found at Carausupe. The earliest ones seem to be made out of pelican bones. The flute became the quena, which remains popular even 5,000 years in Peruvian music. And here I have a quena, a souvenir of Peru. Obviously, I don't know how to play it. Archaeologists found a quipu in Carausupe, which is a recording device made of knotted strings. Quipus were used all over Peru up until Inca times. But quipus started here at Caral before 3000 BCE. These seem to be a logographic form of writing, something like the Chinese characters or hieroglyphics. This appears to be one of the world's earliest forms of writing. In 2003, archaeologists digging in an area near Barranca in Norte Chico found a gourd with a carved figure on it. The gourd depicted a religious icon showing a feline face with fangs, holding a staff in each hand. It was called the staff deity or the fanged deity. It was dated to 2250 BCE. It is the first depiction of a god anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. In fact, you might even call it the oldest American idol. Sorry, that's a dad joke, as my daughter would say. As we shall see, in many subsequent Peruvian cultures, there were fanged deities, right up to the Incas nearly 4,000 years later. Now here I have a gourd It doesn't have a fanged deity, but this is purchased in Peru, and it gives you an idea of the designs that they can carve on gourds. Peru's Norte Chico area is rightly considered one of the world's 6 cradles of human civilization. It is the only cradle of humanization that is found in the southern hemisphere. The Norte Chico cities were abandoned around 1800 BCE as settlements began to move inland. There are some signs of beginnings of conflict between groups, or just maybe they were destroyed by an early El Nino event. But it's a mystery of why the Norte Chico settlements were abandoned. Mountain temples, brain surgery, and lines in the sand. The Chavin people built a city high up in the Andes Mountains near Huaraz at over 10,000 feet, the first of the Peruvian civilizations in the Andes. Until the late 20th century, Chavin was considered to be the mother culture of Peru, the oldest of ancient Peru's civilizations. But as we now know, the north coast of Peru had advanced civilizations before. Construction of the large temple called Chavin de Huantar began around 12,000 BCE. It is located midway between the Amazon jungle and the Pacific coast, close to mountain passes to each area, allowing them to trade with both the coast and the jungle people. In fact, obsidian artifacts were found here, yet the closest source for obsidian is over 300 miles away. The site was discovered in the 1920s by famed Peruvian archaeologist Julio Tello. It is located near the Nevado de Huascaran, the highest mountain in Peru. The temple has a labyrinth of underground passageways inside, a truly amazing engineering feat. Stone tenon head carvings on the walls of Chavin de Huantar, and then here is also a fanged deity. Some of Peru's first stirrup vessels appeared at Chavin. These are named for their shape like a horse's stirrup. Of course, there were no horses in Peru during the Chavin era. The stirrup shape was simply used to pour liquids from the vessel. Note also the feline, probably a jaguar, commonly depicted in Chavin art. It has a San Pedro cactus body, indicating they use this hallucinogenic plant in religious rituals. Here's a small example of a stirrup type vessel that is a souvenir of Peru. And you see, it could just pour from the vessel. A model of a 13-foot tall carving, El Lanzón, is uncovered by Julio Tello, which he named after the Spanish word for lance. Carved from granite, El Lanzón appears to be a person with snakes wound around his head and a ferocious face of a fanged feline deity. The Chavin culture developed advanced metallurgy techniques like soldering metal pieces together. They also developed the repoussé process, in which a metal is heated, then coated with mud, tar, or wax, then hammered from behind to create a design on the front. The Chavin influence spread over 1,000 miles up and down Peru's coast from north to south. They were also excellent textile weavers, especially at their branch site in Paracas on the coast, about 105 miles south of Lima. The Paracas culture was located on the southern coast of Peru. Julio Tello uncovered the site in 1924, finding hundreds of mummies and elaborate textiles. A museum with his name and relics he found is located in Paracas. It's an extremely dry desert here in Paracas, just like on the northern coast. Paracas produced some of the finest woven cotton cloth in ancient Peru. Their textile designs resemble the deities carved in stone at Chavin. Most of the cloth was used as burial wraps for mummies. Hundreds of mummy bundles were found by Julio Tello here at Paracas. Weaving in ancient Peru had many applications: to make roofs for homes, bridges over the river, armor for soldiers, slingshots for hunting, and for recording and documenting advices, including quipus. Among the mummies, Julio Tello found bodies with deformed skulls. Probably the skulls had been banded from infancy in order to attain this shape. However, the reddish hair on this skull is really a mystery. The Paracas culture is also known for its skull surgery, like craniotomies and cranioplasty, which were practiced as long ago as 2000 BCE. This type of brain surgery, also known as trepanation, continued in subsequent cultures throughout the Inca period. Ancient Peruvians cut open the skull to relieve pressure from blunt trauma injuries, such as when a soldier was injured in battle, or maybe even for religious purposes. There's no evidence of anesthesia used for any of these surgeries, although coca leaves or a fermented beverage may have been used. Sometimes pieces of bone or a piece of gold were placed under the skin to protect the brain, called a cranioplasty. The earlier Peruvians had no knowledge of sterile operating techniques when they conducted these brain surgeries. Yet many of these ancient brain surgeries were successful, as evidenced by subsequent bone growth around the wound. A study in 2018 of 800 recovered skulls showed the death rate after trepanation to be between 17 and 25%. So in other words, over 3/4 survived. Dr. David Kushner of the University of Miami Medical School pointed out that during the American Civil War, the death rate of soldiers undergoing trepanation due to skull injuries was twice the death rate of ancient Peruvian brain surgeries. During the US Civil War in the 1860s, the death rate ranged from 46 to 56%, compared to the ancient Peru 700 BCE to 200 CE death rate of 17 to 25%. So how did the ancient Peruvian brain surgeons get better results than surgeons 2,000 years later? That, my friends, is a mystery of Peru. Nazca is located about 120 miles south of Paracas. Weavers and potters in the Nazca Valley followed the Paracas traditions, but also began to produce ceramics with more vivid colors, showing depictions of animals, and some of these had never been seen in the desert environment before. Around 500 BCE to 600 CE, the Nazca people decided to use the arid plain north of their settlement like a gigantic sketch pad. They drew large images, including some 300 geometric shapes called geoglyphs, and 700 plant and animal figures called biomorphs. They are spread out over a 310 square mile area, and these lines are nearly imperceptible from the ground. Many people have proposed theories why these lines were created. Here's a statue of Maria Reka, a German mathematician who, starting in the 1940s, made the Nazca lines her life work. Known as the Lady of the Lines, she concluded that they were an astronomical calendar in her book, Mystery on the Desert. Nazca has images of a condor that has a 426-foot wingspan, a monkey that is 300 feet wide, and this is a 150 foot long spider. Eric von Daniken published a book, Chariots of the Gods, in 1968, claiming the lines were made by ancient astronauts from outer space who gave instructions to humans to build a landing area for spaceships. Archaeologists quickly dismissed his theories as pseudoscience. So the question is how and why the Nazca lines were made remains. The how part of the lines question is the easier one to answer. A design can be transferred to a larger area by tracing using a taut rope and a large tree branch stuck in the ground, or a grid system can be used. The dark surface, rocks, and earth is removed, revealing that underneath there is a light powdery gypsum layer. A second line is traced to make the width of the line so that more of the dark surface underground is removed. And then rocks are piled high on the edges of the line, helping to accentuate the lines. The why did they make the lines? That is the more difficult question to answer. More recent theories say the geoglyphs were paths linked to the underground aquifers. Others ask, why do many geoglyphs point to the mountains? Is it because mountains are secure, are sources of valuable water for desert people? Or are they asking their gods up in the sky to provide them water? Do the lines represent mountain worship and fertility? But studies have not yet explained any of these hypotheses. So why the lines of Nazca are there is still one of the biggest mysteries of Peru. Sex, drugs, and surfing. So don't fall asleep during this section. Near the town of Trujillo in northern Peru, the Moche people lived in the valley of the Moche River. They built an empire centered here along 250 miles of the desert coast, starting in the first centuries of the Common Era. The Moche people were incredible builders, excellent artists, proficient fishermen, expert farmers, and ferocious warriors. They were the first Peruvian culture to build an extensive road system that led all the way into the Amazon jungle. The Incas later incorporated the Moche roads into their own road system. The Mochi built their capital with the Huaca del Sol and the Huaca de la Luna, the temples of the sun and the moon. Both were uncovered by German archaeologist Max Uli back in 1899. The Temple of the Sun was built with over 140 million adobe bricks and is the largest pre-Columbian structure in all of Peru. But 60% of it has been eroded by the elements. Much of this was destroyed by the Spanish diversion of the Moche River to allow them to more easily remove the temple's treasures. The Temple of the Sun is not open to the public. The Temple of the Moon is smaller in size, has many rooms and ceremonial galleries. The temple is open to visitors. A pioneer in Peruvian archaeology, Rafael Larco Hoyle, saved thousands of ancient artifacts here from the black market for Peruvian relics. Many are on display at the Larco Museum in Lima. The Moche built miles of irrigation canals, aqueducts, and field systems to water crops. Note the Feng deity here on the wall of the Temple of the Moon. The Moche Feng deity is holding here a San Pedro cactus that appears to be conducting a religious ritual. San Pedro cactus contains the hallucinogen mescaline and was used since the times of the Chavin culture 1000 BCE. The cactus was made into a beverage by shamans who believe all sickness comes from evil spirits in the body that come from another world. The shamans conduct hallucinogenic rituals to remove evil spirits from the body. Shamans have existed in nearly all cultures around the world, and they still exist today in Peru. The Moche were famed for their ceramics, which often depicted their everyday life. This ceramic shows two women helping a man who has imbibed a little too much chicha, corn beer. This is part of a stirrup spout pitcher. This man is using coca like modern Andean people do. With a few dry leaves in his mouth formed into a quid, he takes some powdered lime, which are calcium oxides, from a gourd with a spatula to put into his mouth. This lime helps extract a small amount of the calming ingredients from coca leaves. The Moche people were the most skilled metalsmiths in all of ancient Peru. They perfected an electrochemical plating process for gilding copper objects. Tumi is the Quechua word for knife. This one is gold with semi-precious stones. The Moche sometimes use tumis for human sacrifice, decapitating their captured prisoners from battle. Tumis are now hung on walls all over Peru for good luck. The blue eyes here are made of lapis lazuli. They stare out of a golden Moche head. Here's two examples of Moche fanged deities. The Moche use dried tortora reeds that grow nearby to make small reed boats for fishing and hunting sea lions in the Pacific. Even today, in the beach towns near the Moche temples in Trujillo, the locals paddle their caballitos de totora, which they are called the little horses of totora, over incoming waves to a good fishing spot. When done fishing, they catch a wave and get a good ride back into shore. Early Moche fishermen very well may have invented surfing nearly 2,000 years ago, centuries before the Polynesians and Duke Kahanamoku in Hawaii. We'll see more of this when we do a virtual tour of Trujillo in our next class. The Moche people were notable for showing their daily lives in their ceramic pottery, and their daily lives included sex acts. Moche ceramics are more overtly sexual than any other ancient artwork anywhere else in the world, even surpassing the Kama Sutra of India, which was about the same era. The Spanish conquistadors were appalled when they saw this type of artwork. They smashed and destroyed all the pieces they could find. To the Spaniards' Catholic faith, these were examples of the sinfulness of paganism. In their erotic pottery, Moche depicted male masturbation, anal sex, kissing, and various other sexual positions. Some claim that some of the pottery portrays male homosexuality, although scholars have not confirmed this. Also, for some unknown reason, scientists have found that very few of the erotic ceramics portrayed sex acts that would lead to pregnancy. In some pottery, the male seems to be in the process of turning into a fanged deity. Maybe this is showing some kind of religious ritual. Could sex have been part of shaman ritual healing? It's another one of those mysteries of Peru. Now, warning here, if you think you might be sensitive to the following images, feel free to look away. But I think that we are all adults. These images are included here only to study in the name of science. Okay, the Moche Lord of Sipan. It was February 25th, 1987. Walter Alva, the Peruvian archaeologist, was director of the Lambayeques Bruning Museum near Chiclayo in northern Peru. He was feeling miserable with bronchitis, and then the phone rang. It was the local chief of police. They had retrieved some suspicious-looking items that he wanted Alva to see. With an awful cough, Alva agreed to come over first thing next morning. But the police chief insisted he come over now. He said tomorrow would be too late. On arriving at the police station, Alva was presented with artifacts wrapped in rough paper. There was a pure gold face with shining blue eyes. Two giant peanuts were made of pure gold. A feline head also was made of gold with its snarling, jagged fangs. Alva no longer felt unwell. Despite his decades of excavations all around Peru, he had never seen anything like this. Yet all of them came from a pyramid at the nearby village of Sipan. At dawn, Alva and a crew of 20 armed policemen were at the pyramid, but news of the discovery had already gotten out. The site was swarming with frantic shovel-wielding, tomb-raiding vaqueros gripped with gold fever. As the police arrived, the crowd quickly dispersed, leaving a dusty field of craters to the archaeologist. The discovery of the tomb of the Lord of Sipan in 1987 has had about as much impact on Peru as the discovery of King Tut's tomb in 1922 had on Egypt. The Lord of Sipan, in Spanish this is called El Señor de Sipan, was buried with hundreds of pieces of exquisite pottery, gold, and silver items, as befitting his status. The relics are on display at the Bruning Museum in Lambayeque near Chiclayo. You'll be able to see the relics there, unless, of course, like many rock stars, the Lord of Sipan artifacts are on one of their many world tours. Now, this gold back flap, an article of clothing hung from the belt, was part of a Moche warrior's costume. This back flap is topped with a depiction of the decapitator deity, which you can see at the arrow here, and he's holding a ceremonial Tumi knife in one hand. The back flap was one of the items originally looted from the Lord of Sipan tomb back in 1987. It was smuggled out of Peru by traffickers sometimes later. However, in 1997, undercover FBI agents purchased it in a sting operation that took place in a restaurant stop along the New Jersey Turnpike. On July 15, 1998, the FBI held a ceremony to officially return the back flap to Peru. It is now in a museum in Lima. Building the shoulders for giants. Now, this is a reference to an old quote from Sir Isaac Newton that stated, "If I have seen farther than most, it is because I have stood on the shoulders of giants." The giants here refer to the Incas, who built up their empire on the previous civilizations that preceded them, all of which we have been discussing and will continue to discuss here. The Tiwanaku built at an altitude of over 12,500 feet around Lake Titicaca, one of the highest ancient settlements in the world. The empire extended into Bolivia. Now, I have to say, if you asked a Bolivian, they would say the Tiwanaku Empire extended into Peru. And the Peruvians would say back to them, Titi para Peru, Caca para Bolivia. There is quite a rivalry among countries in South America. The Tiwanaku Empire was at its peak during the same time period as the Moche of the North, about 200 BCE. The Tiwanaku was one of the first civilizations in South America to move and cut large stones to build monuments. Some stones weighed 26 tons, yet of course they had no use of the wheel. So it's not really known exactly what techniques they used, but whatever it was, the Incas copied them. Here's the Sun Gate, Puerto del Sol in Tiwanaku. And note the close-up on the right. This is the staff god with fangs on his face that we've seen before. The Lima culture emerged on the coast as the Chavin culture of the mountains declined. It was located in the Rimac, Chillon, and Lurin river valleys along the central coast and modern-day city of Lima. In fact, some of the restored ruins are tourist attractions and can be visited. Huaca Pucllana was built around 500 CE. It is located in Miraflores. It was a huge pyramid, 300 feet by 1,500 feet at the base and 67 feet tall. It has an excellent Peruvian restaurant attached, so it's really good for touring and then having a nice meal. Huaca Huacayamarca has been restored and is located in the San Isidro suburb of Lima. It features a long ramp up to the top. Pachacamac is just south of Lima and was built around 600 CE. It was an oracle site used for religious pilgrimages, mummy burials, and it lasted into the Inca Empire. This site is still being excavated, as you can see here. The Chimu developed from the remnants of the Moche culture near Trujillo, starting around 850 CE. Here they built their capital, Chanchan. At the same time, the Incas were gaining power in the southern Andes. The Chimu Empire stretched over 600 miles along the northern coast of Peru. At the time, it was the largest empire in the history of the Americas. Chanchan is near the ancient Moche temples of the sun and moon and once had over 100,000 residents. It is the world's largest adobe brick city with a labyrinth of 25-foot tall adobe walls stretching out 200 feet long and more. The Chimu was the last kingdom that had a chance to slow down Inca expansion. By the 1470s, they were overwhelmed and became part of the Inca Empire. Chanchan has several ciudadelas, or compounds, like cities within a city, each with massive walls 30 feet high and 10 feet wide. Each compound was a shrine and a mausoleum for the Chimu leader's mummy. The next monarch then would build his own compound, while the deceased ruler's compound with his mummy was kept as a shrine by the family. This custom of mummy shrines was later continued by the Incas. Note the carvings with rainbows above the human figures on this wall at Chanchan. Known for their metalworking, the Chimu, unlike other conquered Andean cultures, were not forced by the Incas to change their way of life. Instead, Inca teachers came and studied their farming and irrigation methods, and Chimu goldsmiths were sent to Cusco to teach Inca craftsmen. Flourishing in the northern highlands at the edge of the jungle, the Chachapoyas culture was contemporary with the Chimu, but it lived in the cloud forest of the eastern slopes of the Andes. They were known as the warriors of the cloud because they resisted annexation by the Inca Empire. The Chachapoyas built a huge stone city called Cuela. Since they built such an imposing fortress, they must have felt threatened, most likely from the Incas. Just like other ancient Peruvians, the Chachapoyas honored their dead. In fact, they took some extraordinary steps to keep their deceased elite members from being disturbed during their eternal rest. They chose an inaccessible place for their mummies, high up on a cliff. Although known to local people, the sarcophagi of Carajilla were only rediscovered in 1985 by Peruvian archaeologist Federico Kaufman Doig, who climbed up the face of this rock very much like this explorer to the National Geographic did a few years ago. Built around 1450, these sarcophagi remained intact for over 400 years in this secluded spot. Each sarcophagus is over 8 feet tall and is made of clay, rocks, and twigs. Each one contains a mummified body in a fetal position in the lower portion. The faces have exaggerated chins. Some have skulls on their heads, perhaps trophies captured in battle. Now, do you get a feeling, like maybe you've seen these faces before, maybe in Bruce Gobioff's class on exotic South America? Well, many others have noticed this connection too, but it is still a mystery. And just as a note, Chachapoyas and Easter Island are about 2,500 miles apart. The navel of the world. This is where we find out what a belly button has to do with the history of Peru. Inca legends say that the world was in complete darkness when the creator god Viracocha emerged out of Lake Titicaca. Viracocha created the sun, Inti, the moon, and the stars. Once the world had light, Viracocha took soft clay and molded two humans, a man and a woman. The first two humans were Manco Capac, which means splendid foundation, and Mama Occhio, which means mother fertility. They were the son and daughter of Inti, the sun. Viracocha sent them out to found the nations of the world. After the creation of humans, Viracocha departed Lake Titicaca and headed northwest. By tradition, he crossed the Andes, reached the equator, where the sun is at its highest point in the sky. He walked across the sea, promising his people that he would one day return. The brother and sister, Manco Capac and Mama Occhio, also went northwest from Lake Titicaca. Note the consistency of the northwest direction. What else in Peru goes in the northwest direction? Well, the answer is that great river of stars in the sky, the Milky Way, which the Incas call Wilcamayu. These two superheroes of the Incas searched for fertile soil to establish a new kingdom of humans. When they reached a certain valley, Manco Capac pushed the royal staff into the soil to test it. The staff sank completely into the soil. This was the fertile navel of the earth that they were looking for. It was named the Quechua word for navel or belly button, Cusco. During the journey, Manco Capac and Mama Ocllo had a son, Sinchi Roca. He later became the second Sapa Inca, meaning the supreme ruler. This established the continuous Inca pattern of royal incest to help keep the emperor bloodline pure. Now in Cusco, Manco Capac named his empire Tahuantinsuyo, meaning the empire of the four quarters, as it covered the entire world, all parts of the world known to them. 7 Sapa Incas followed, slowly expanding the Inca Empire in the nearby Andes in the years from 1200 CE to 1438. The 9th Sapa Inca was Pachacutec, meaning the transformer of the world. With an army of 200,000 foot soldiers at his disposal, they were ready on a moment's notice, kind of like the Minutemen of the U.S. Continental Army. He began a wide expansion of the Inca Empire in 1438. The Inca soldier weapons were bolas and slings, and the atlatl, which is a spear-throwing device. Javelin-like spears could reach speeds of 90 miles per hour. Pachacutec conquered by combination of diplomacy and intimidation. A neighboring region would be invited to join the Inca Empire. If the region agreed to join, new Inca leaders were brought into the region. And then the leaders of the new territory would be removed and taken to Cusco to learn the ways of the Inca. If a region leader decided not to join the Inca Empire, Pachacutec simply overwhelmed them with his vast army. Once overtaken, if the uncooperative leaders had somehow survived the battle, the Incas took them as prisoners back to Cusco and punished them for not acquiescing. This Spanish drawing here shows Pachacutec's prisoners, one of his prisoners having his eyeballs removed, rendering him blind. Here is an uncooperative conquered leader about to be beheaded. Pachacutec's son, Tupac Inca Yupanqui, completed the Inca Empire's expansion from southern Colombia all the way south to northern Chile. This was a distance of about 3,000 miles, the largest empire ever in the Americas, and greater than the extent of the Roman Empire. By the reign of the 11th Inca in 1493, Pachacutec's grandson, Huayna Capac, the Inca Empire was well established. Somewhere around 1525, Huayna Capac heard about the incursions of white-skinned people to the north. Unknown to him, there were already infectious diseases from Europe invading the Inca Empire. By 1527, both Huayna Capac and his presumed heir had died from European diseases. Following these deaths, the Inca Empire fell into chaos. Now, the Inca throne was claimed by 2 of Huayna Capac's sons from different wives, Huascar and Atahualpa, who were half-brothers. Huascar installed himself as Sapa Inca in Cusco, while Atahualpa declared himself as Sapa Inca in Quito, where Huayna Capac had been located. 4 years of brutal civil war followed as Atahualpa's and Huascar's forces met each other in battles across the Andes. Atahualpa's forces captured Huascar and he was imprisoned. Atahualpa became the Sapa Inca. It was now April 1532. Sapa Inca Atahualpa marched his troops from Quito south toward Cusco for his official coronation as emperor. On the way, he stopped with his 80,000 soldier army in Cajamarca, where there were hot mineral baths. He needed to rest and pray for his success as emperor. The stage is now set for one of the most decisive confrontations ever in world history. But first, let's switch gears a moment to talk about the life in the days of the Incas. The Inca rulers were descended from the sun and were worshipped as gods since they were considered the son of the sun. Note, the Inca sun god is depicted with fangs. Just as many deities in Peru had been depicted for thousands of years. The sun god Inti is remembered today in Peru's currency, the sol, which means sun in Spanish. Around Cusco, there were temples and shrines honoring each of the previous Sapa Incas, where their mummies were stored and maintained by their families. For example, in one annual ceremony, people from the 4 quarters of the empire came to see the mummies of former Inca emperors brought out from their shrines to sit in the main plaza of Cusco. Current rulers sprinkled chicha on the ground to honor Pachamama, the Earth Mother, then offered a toast to the mummies. Each mummy had a symbolic sip of chicha, or corn beer. Each royal mummy was dressed in his finery and carried here from his estate by attendants, who also would brush away any flies. Mita was the Inca system of labor taxation. In exchange for this labor, communities received from the empire terrace building, irrigation channels, road networks, and monthly feast days. Mita management of farming output was divided. 1/3 went to the community, 1/3 to the empire, and 1/3 for personal consumption. With excess food put into storage, the Incas put a virtual end to hunger in their empire. Textiles and clothing were important cultural identity, with each region having distinct patterns encoded as woven symbols, something like hieroglyphics. The Incas lived by three guiding principles to ensure the continued coexistence of all the Incas. Do not be a thief, do not be a liar, and do not be idle. The Spanish chronicles recount that almost every month, huge parties were thrown in every Inca town thanking the people for their work. Gifts were given and good workers were publicly recognized. Much corn beer, called chicha de jora, was consumed. One of the most important tasks was building agricultural terraces across the empire. Corn and potatoes were the most common crops on the terraces. Irrigation canals were another massive Inca Works project. Sometimes miles of channels had to be built going up into the mountains to bring glacial runoff down for crops. Every town had a storehouse known as a kolka, which held tons of food. Kolkas were built on hillsides to keep stored items dry and cool. The Incas also invented the world's first freeze-drying process, leaving potatoes out in the cold night air and then squeezing any moisture out. Then the potatoes were dried during the daytime. The resulting chuño is still a common Andean food. The Incas ate only 2 meals a day, generally something cooked over a fire, made from wood or llama dung. Fresh meat was rare, but an alternate food was charqui, salted and dried. Preserved llama meat that gave us today's term jerky. One of the most incredible achievements of the Inca Empire was the road system of over 25,000 miles through what is now 6 different countries. The Incas ate along every Inca road were tambos, or rest houses with barracks for travelers and food supplies. Based in the tambos, chasquis were relay runners who navigated the road. They took wrapped quipus, or small packages, a distance of about 12 miles to the next tambo, where another chasqui would take over. Every year, Inca officials would search for girls of about 10 years of age, selecting them for their beauty and talents to be chosen women, called akia kuna. They were educated in temples, learning to weave textiles, as well as how to make chicha beer by chewing corn kernels and then allowing the mixture to ferment. They became servants of the Sapa Inca. Sometimes the younger girls were offered as human sacrifice up in the mountains. This was considered a high honor. Quipu is the Quechua word for knot. The quipu consists of knotted, color-coded strings used to record food inventories, a population census, traditional stories, basically anything that could be recorded on a document. The knowledge of reading quipus disappeared after the conquest as the Spaniards burned the quipus and killed the scribes who could read them. The quipu used a decimal numbering system with a 0. Europeans of this era rejected the concept of a 0, although it was used in Arabic and Muslim numbering systems. Quipu writing is one of the world's oldest writing forms, roughly from the same period as the Mesopotamian cuneiform. The quipus are such an unusual written method that some won't accept them as true writing. Archaeologists are still trying to decipher quipus. Again, it's one of the mysteries of Peru. As we've said, the Milky Way is very prominent in the Andean sky and very important to Inca culture. Like all ancient cultures around the world, the Incas studied their surroundings to determine the cycles of nature. The Incas classified their world into 3 realms: the Hanan Paicha, the upper realm, everything in the sky, like the planets, stars, sun, and moon. Kaipacha, the middle realm, the earth, plants, humans, everything on the earth. And the Uchapacha, the inner realm, everything underground, the new life, demons, and the Pachamama, the earth mother. In the Inca universe, each realm was interconnected with each of the other realms. The Inca grouped their stars into constellations, seeing animals from their daily lives when they looked at the stars. But they saw things much differently than Northern Hemisphere constellations based on Greek, Roman, or Babylonian mythology. The Incas were one of the few cultures in the world who found constellations in the darkness between the stars, as well as in the stars themselves. These dark blotches in the Milky Way were seen as animals and considered living forms of earthly creatures. The dark constellations were silhouettes of animals that came to drink from the waters of the celestial river, the Milky Way. For the Incas, these dark cloud creatures could leap out of the sky and behave in ways up there in the Pacha that could predict natural events down here, the Kaipacha. The Yakuna was one constellation. It consists of two yamas, the mother yama and a nursing baby yama. Depending on the clarity or fuzziness of the mother yama constellation during certain parts of the year, it would forecast rainy or dry seasons. The Michik is the shepherd that protects the yamas from danger by throwing open its arm to scare away any threats. Atok, this is the fox found close to the yamas because he intends to eat them, taking them away from the shepherd constellation who is caring for the yamas up in the sky. The Clash of the Titans. Francisco Pizarro was born sometime around 1471 to 1473. This date is really a rough guess. He was born in Trujillo, Spain, the illegitimate son of a Spanish soldier. He did not attend school, get an education, or learn how to read or write. As a young man, he was a swineherder to help out his family. By his 20s, Pizarro had heard the news of Columbus's expeditions to the New World. He'd heard about Spanish legends of knight errantry and stories of centuries of wars taking the Iberian Peninsula back from the Moors, known as the Reconquista. All these stories filled the minds of young Spaniards of his age and low economic status, with dreams of becoming adventurers and hidalgos. He first went on to the Indies, the Spanish name for the New World in that time, in 1502 when he was around age 30. In 1513, Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed Panama and became the first European to see the long-sought South Sea, now called the Pacific Ocean. With Balboa was the 40-some-year-old Francisco Pizarro. A few years later, Balboa tried to seize power in Panama and was arrested by none other than Pizarro. Balboa was convicted of treason, sentenced to death by beheading in 1519. As a reward for his service, Pizarro was appointed the mayor of the new city of Panama, where he remained until 1523. In Panama, Pizarro heard rumors about a gold-filled empire to the south called Peru. He also heard the success of his second cousin, Hernan Cortés, conquering the Aztecs in 1519. He formed a partnership with Diego de Almagro to equally share any region that they would conquer. Pizarro became expedition leader, and Pizarro made two voyages south trying to find the legendary Peru. In 1524, the expedition was a dismal failure. Almagro lost an eye in the process in a battle with the natives. In 1526, Pizarro and his soldiers sailed to the city of Tumbes in today's Peru. They were warmly received and found gold and silver decorations. For the first time, they saw Peruvian llamas, which Pizarro called little camels. Inspired with the riches, Pizarro returned to Panama, whose governor refused giving approval for any more voyages. So Pizarro went over the governor's head and sailed to Spain. He got an audience with the king, Charles I of Spain, also called Charles V, or Carlos Quinto, as he was also the Holy Roman Emperor. Pizarro showed the treasures and gained the crown's approval for a voyage to conquer Peru. Pizarro then stopped by his hometown of Trujillo, gathered 4 of his half-brothers and other assorted adventurers, and set sail again for Peru. In 1532, Pizarro returned to Tumbes and found it in ruins. He was told it had been destroyed by Inca armies during the civil war between brothers, who both claimed to be emperor. The Inca Empire was also decimated by a disease that killed the prior emperor. Atahualpa was now emperor, but all his empire was in complete disorder. Atahualpa felt little or no alarm when he received news from his Chasqui messengers about the small group of Spaniards. Other small groups had landed before and then left. Atahualpa sent his envoy to meet Pizarro, who agreed to come meet Atahualpa in Cajamarca, camped nearby at the Inca Baths. Pizarro and his soldiers climbed the steep Andean road, exhausted by the thin, high-altitude air, but they marveled at the Inca Empire, their vast terraces of corn, shepherds herding llamas, and huge stone fortresses guarding mountain passes. The Spaniards met groups who had opposed Atahualpa in the Civil War. Some groups joined in with Pizarro, including the Chachapoyas people. Finally, Pizarro arrived just outside of Cajamarca. He had 106 foot soldiers and 62 horsemen. They had 4 small cannons and 8 or 9 arquebuses, primitive muskets. Neither was very accurate nor of much use at close distance. However, they did make a lot of noise and could frighten anyone who had never heard or seen them before. The date was November 15th, 1532. The Spaniards could see the Inca soldiers spread before them in the valley. Pizarro sent Hernando de Soto, along with his half-brother Hernando, to meet Atahualpa at the baths of Cajamarca. Yes, this is the same Hernando de Soto who came to Florida in 1539 and traveled around the southeast U.S. to the Mississippi River. He's also the only person with 2 counties named after him in Florida. Using an interpreter, the Spaniards conveyed to Atahualpa that their leader, Pizarro, greatly respected the emperor. Atahualpa agreed to a meeting in Cajamarca's plaza the following day. That night, the Spaniards began to realize the desperate situation they had just marched themselves into. There were tens of thousands of tents on the hillsides, each with a campfire, and each campfire had a group of Inca warriors. As one Spaniard described, there were as many fires in the hills as there were stars in the sky. Pizarro had a classic dilemma. Should he stay or should he go? The Spaniards were surrounded by an Inca army of maybe 80,000 Inca soldiers, armed with spears, clubs, maces, all waiting just to take orders. There were exactly 168 Spaniards, and that included Pizarro. To attack the huge Inca army would be suicidal. Even though they had some firearms and some 60 or so horses, the Spaniards were outnumbered over 400 to 1. They could try to go back to the coast, but they were over a week of difficult marching up over the mountains to get to the coast, plus the mountains were full of Inca armies. Pizarro had no real idea what to do, but realized they were at a point of no return. The Spaniards were terrified they would be slaughtered. Most of them likely had sleepless nights. The answer to the question, should they stay or should they go, is the name of that 1982 group that sang that song. The answer was Clash. A Game of Thrones. The next morning was November 16th, 1532. The Spaniards planned an ambush. Just after daybreak, they hid themselves in Cajamarca's main plaza. They waited all morning for Atahualpa and the Incas to arrive. They began thinking their secret plan may have been discovered. The Spaniards thought the Inca army had already surrounded them, perhaps, and there would be no way for them to escape from the plaza. It was reported later that many soldiers were in such pure terror for their lives that they urinated in their own pants. All afternoon they waited. Finally, Pizarro sent a message to promise Atahualpa that, quote, no harm or insult would come to him. Finally, just a little before sunset, Atahualpa and his entourage began marching to Cajamarca. A Spaniard wrote, the Indians all wore large silver and gold discs like crowns on their head. Atahualpa was carried on a silver litter supported by 80 noblemen. Also entering the plaza were about 6,000 to 8,000 soldiers, some carrying clubs and slings. But Atahualpa saw no Spaniard in the town square meeting for him when he arrived. He impatiently called out, where are those dogs? At that moment, Friar Vicente de Valverde came from the darkness to Atahualpa with a translator, a cross, and a Bible. Valverde explained his role as priest and the requerimiento of the Spanish crown. This was the king's requirement as keeper of the faith that the friar explained the story of the church and the teachings of Jesus Christ to the people before any conquest in new territories. The friar gave his explanation and asked Atahualpa to pay tribute to the Spanish king who had sent him. Atahualpa asked, from where do you get the authority to say these things to me? Valverde replied, all the knowledge of this power is in this book, handing Atahualpa the Bible. Atahualpa looked over the Bible and tried to open it. Friar Valverde tried to help him turn a page. Atahualpa brushed the friar's hand away. The Inca smelled the Bible. He listened to it, but gained nothing from it. Of course, he had never seen a book, nor any kind of writing ever before. Atahualpa said to Valverde, his God, the sun, continues to watch over his people and returns to his people every day. Now, with his face flushing with anger, Atahualpa declared he would not pay tribute to a God killed by his own people, the very people that he had created. Nor would he pay tribute to any other king. He threw the Bible to the ground. Valverde couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. This was simple and clear blasphemy, and so Valverde turned to Pizarro saying, "Come out, you Christians, these enemy dogs of Christ reject the things of God. Let them feel the power of the one true God." Pizarro gave the signal for the cannons to fire. The Spaniards came out of hiding, shouting, "Santiago y a ellos." This was the battle cry during the centuries of the Moorish Reconquista wars. It's a battle cry invoking St. James, the patron saint of Spain. The cavalry rushed the horrified Inca ranks and began a wholesale slaughter. The Spaniards blocked all the plaza exits and none of the Incas could escape. Somewhere around 5,000 to 8,000 of Atahualpa's men were killed in the slaughter during the next hour. One Spaniard later wrote, "The Incas were so fearful they were climbing on top of each other, forming mounds of bodies that suffocated those below." Atahualpa's litter fell downward as his noblemen supporting it were killed. Some of the Incas continued supporting the litter on their shoulders, even though their arms had been sliced off by the Spaniards. Pizarro headed for Atahualpa, protecting him by deflecting an attempted stabbing by a Spanish soldier. Pizarro suffered the only injury of any Spaniard in the entire melee, a small cut on his arm. Now, we will take a little pause. The conquest of the Incas has not been portrayed in film or dramatized very often, but it was in a movie from quite a few years ago called The Royal Hunt of the Sun. It was first a stage play by Peter Shaffer that was in London and Broadway in the mid-1960s, and then it was turned into a movie released in October 1969. It is notable for several reasons. Pizarro was played by a British actor who was later in a couple of popular movies, including 1973 movie The Sting, and then he also played Quint in the 1975 movie Jaws, namely Robert Shaw. Atahualpa is played by an unusual choice that's none other than Baron von Trapp from the 1964 Sound of Music, Christopher Plummer, who apparently wanted to play a role a little bit out of character. Robert Shaw's Pizarro is shown in a somewhat favorable light and even sympathetic to the Inca Atahualpa. Plummer gives a rather eccentric portrayal of his character, Atahualpa. Nigel Davenport, who was later in Chariots of Fire, plays Pizarro's right-hand man, Hernando de Soto. Also, there's Leonard Whiting, who just a year before had played the lead in Franco Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet. He plays the role of young Martin. So we're going to look at the battle scene in Cajamarca. Pizarro has just received word from his scouts that the Inca and his retinue are finally approaching the plaza. And here we go.
Where is the god?
I am a priest of God.
He doesn't want the priest. He wants the god.
Our God cannot be seen.
I may see him.
No. He was killed by men and went into the sky. I am the answer to all mysteries. Hark, pagan, while I expound. First, God created heaven and earth, in which the bad are punished with eternal suffering, and the good rewarded with life hereafter. And this God created man from dust and gave him a spiritual life, which we call the soul. No man is free from sin, except our Savior, Jesus Christ. He was killed and crucified on a wooden cross like the one you see here. Now Jesus Christ, by his own virtue, rose from the dead, and 40 days later ascended into heaven, where he sits at the right hand of the Father. He wished that his apostle, St. Peter, be the prince of all his apostles and the successors, as well as all other Christians. And that the Roman pontiffs, as we Christians call the popes, have the same power given to St. Peter by God. The Roman pontiff, who now lives on earth, understands that the people and nations of this kingdom ignore our Creator, their true God, and blindly worship idols and images in the shape of demons. Therefore, he has commanded our King, Carlos V, to bring all men to belief in the true God. In Christ's name, I charge you, declare yourself his willing vassal.
By what power do you speak?
By this, the word of God.
God. God.
God. Francisco Pizarro! Why do you stay your hand when Christ is insulted? Let this pagan feel the power of your arm! I absolve you all! Santiago!
Okay, so out of the plaza, Atahualpa was rushed away from the slaughter and locked up in a room adjacent to the plaza. The Spaniards could not believe their good fortune in capturing Atahualpa. They felt blessed that God's hand had intervened in a desperate situation where they were impossibly outnumbered. The Spaniards gave thanks to God. The Spaniards instructed Atahualpa to continue to give orders to his people, but he would be killed if his army attempted to rescue him. So Atahualpa was allowed his royal rituals, including visits from his wives who brought food and clothes to him. As was customary, each item was burned by them after a single use. The day after the slaughter in the plaza, the conquistadors looted the Inca camp outside of town, demanded Inca soldiers to be their porters, the women to be slaves, the llamas to be killed for food, and they took as much gold and silver as they could carry. Very shortly, Atahualpa recognized the Spaniards' extraordinary interest in precious metals. At one point, he asked Pizarro, "Do the Spanish people eat gold? Is it a medical cure or for a disease?" The Spaniards were simply amazed when Atahualpa offered to pay a ransom in exchange for his freedom, to fill a room as high as he could reach, about 8 feet up the wall, and the room that was estimated to be 22 feet by 15 feet in size, once with gold and then twice with silver. The emperor's pledge was written and legalized. Pizarro promised to return Atahualpa to Quito when the ransom was fulfilled. With the promised treasure arriving, the Spaniards were impressed by Atahualpa. They judged him to be about 30 years old, with a good bearing, speaking with an air of gravity and authority, like a great ruler. During his captivity over the next few months, he even learned some Spanish, learned about the writing, and was taught the game of chess by Hernando de Soto. Here we see that Atahualpa's ransom room looks like in Cajamarca today. While captive, Atahualpa sent word to his generals to get his imprisoned half-brother Huascar. Atahualpa feared that Huascar would offer a larger ransom to Pizarro. Atahualpa's army forced Huascar to watch his wives and family being executed in front of him. Then Huascar himself was put to death by Atahualpa's soldiers. Week after week, llama caravans with treasures from the 4 quarters of the empire arrived in Cajamarca. Large gold statues, various items of gold and silver, precious stones, all arrived. All was recorded by the Spaniards, piled up and then melted down. 20% was set aside for Carlos Quinto. The room was filled with gold once and then silver twice, and the agreed upon ransom had been paid. Atahualpa now began to understand what a big miscalculation he had made trying to cooperate with the Spaniards. The days passed by after the ransom was fulfilled. The Spaniards showed no move to free Atahualpa. They had absolutely no intention of releasing him or even departing the Inca Empire this time, like the Spaniards had twice before. For their part, some Spaniards were becoming convinced they were in grave danger while Atahualpa was alive. Atahualpa had many loyal followers in the surrounding mountains who would attack as soon as they were given the order. Both Pizarro and De Soto thought Atahualpa had more value as a prisoner. Plus, it would be difficult under their Spanish royal orders to justify his execution. Then a captured Inca soldier arrived in Cajamarca and reported he had been part of an Inca army marching toward Cajamarca to free Atahualpa. Pizarro's men panicked at this news, thinking that any day they were going to be massacred by this Inca army. Pizarro called a council meeting of his staff. It was agreed that Atahualpa was a burden to them. It was decided he would stand trial for the murder of Huascar, worshiping idolatry and treason. An immediate emergency trial was conducted, and by a vote of 13 to 11, Atahualpa was condemned to death by burning at the stake. The Spaniard prepared Atahualpa to be burned alive at the stake for his crimes. This terrified Atahualpa immensely. Inca religion taught if the body were destroyed, then the soul of the person in the afterlife was also destroyed. That's why mummies were so important in the Inca religion, so the sun god each day could shine on the bodies of the departed. Friar Vivaldi intervened. If Atahualpa agreed to be baptized in the Christian faith, his sentence would be commuted. Atahualpa agreed to baptism. His sentence was then reduced to death by strangulation. Atahualpa was executed by strangulation on July 26, 1533. It had been 8 months since the slaughter in the plaza. Shortly later, it was learned that there actually was no Inca army marching to Cajamarca. When Carlos Quinto heard about Atahualpa's execution, the king was outraged. protesting that this offends the divine right of kings upon which my own rule and every other monarch was based. But the riches of Peru were now arriving in Spain for the crown's treasury. At this point, Pizarro had a Monty Hall decision. Stay with door number 1, take the riches they had in Cajamarca, and quietly go back to Spain. Or take door number 2, proceed unto Cusco, and take everything left there that was not already sent to Cajamarca, and perhaps take over the entire Inca Empire, making themselves in charge. Live by the sword, die by the sword. First, let's do a review of the ransom of Atahualpa from the Royal Hunt of the Sun.
How much gold do you have? Make me free. I will fill this room.
It's not possible.
How long?
2 showings of my mother moon.
Now, my lord, let us know what we say. You must strive to keep the peace. You must not escape. You must not urge your men to help you. So, swear.
I swear.
Then I swear too. You fill this room with gold, I set you free.
Over there. Come on.
As we have said, Emperor Atahualpa of the Incas offered a roomful of gold and 2 roomfuls of silver to Francisco Pizarro after his capture. How much was this gold and silver worth at today's precious metal prices? This is considered the largest ransom ever paid for a captured hostage in world history. It was around 6 tons of gold and 12 tons of silver. The ransom amount is estimated to be around 105 billion US dollars at current gold and silver commodity prices. Of course, much of the ransom was paid by handcrafted artifacts, not commodity metals of bullion. This fact is noted by the Guinness Book of World Records. Back to our story. As you remember, Pizarro and the Spaniards had a choice while in Cajamarca. In August 1533, Pizarro picked door number 2, onward to Cusco. The Spaniards marched south, fighting 4 more battles with the Incas at Jauja, Vilcabamba, Vilcaconga, and outside of Cusco before they could enter the Inca capital. Pizarro's secretary wrote about Cusco to Carlos V of Spain. Quote, "Your Majesty is assured that it is so beautiful with such fine buildings, it would be remarkable even in Spain." But the Spaniards barely noticed the fine Inca buildings. They were too busy looting the palaces of gold and silver. Pizarro appointed another one of Huayna Capac's son, 20-year-old Manco, to be a puppet emperor in an attempt to keep the empire quiet while the Spaniards went about their business at hand. Pizarro left his brothers Gonzalo and Juan in charge of Cusco and went to the coast. There, in January 1535, shortly after the Day of the Three Kings, also known as Epiphany, along the Rimac River, he founded his new capital of Peru, calling it La Ciudad de los Reyes, the city of the kings. The Quechua word Rimac, the name of the river, was later corrupted to Lima and became the city's name. Now the surviving Pizarro brothers argued how to split up Peru with the expedition's other partner, Diego de Almagro, Peru into another civil war. But now it was Spaniard versus Spaniard. In 1538, the Pizarro group defeated the Almagro group, and Diego de Almagro was killed. Francisco Pizarro, now almost 70 years old, was a very wealthy man, and Carlos Quinto named him a marquis. The Incas were finally subdued, and the Almagro disagreement was resolved. Or was it? One Sunday afternoon in his palace alongside Lima's Plaza de Armas, Francisco Pizarro had returned from Mass and was eating dinner. Suddenly, a group of Almagro supporters burst into the room. Immediately attacking him, Pizarro was able to kill one attacker, but the others subdued the old man and stabbed him to death. As he died, he made the sign of the cross on the floor in his own blood. It was June 26, 1541. Before his death, he had fathered 2 children by one of Atahualpa's widows, Occhio Yupanqui, who had been an attendant to the Sapa Inca Atahualpa during his 8-month imprisonment. Pizarro's remains were later placed in the cathedral in downtown Lima. In 1977, during restoration of the cathedral, workers found a box marked, "Here lies the head of the Marquis de Francisco Pizarro." It was placed with the rest of his remains in the cathedral, but after DNA testing, it's doubtful whether the new head and the old remains really go together. It's just another mystery of Peru. Thus began the next 500 years of Peru's history. 300 years Spanish colonial Peru, 200 years as a Spanish-speaking republic. Peru's later history didn't turn out any easier than the conquest of Peru was. The past is indeed part of the present every single day in Peru. The empire strikes back. So the question is, why did the Inca Empire want to strike back? Let's take a look back to the trial and death of Atahualpa in 1532.
Usurping the throne and assassinating his brother Huascar, worshipping idols, adulterous practices with a plurality of wives, attempting to incite an insurrection against his Spanish masters. On all of these charges, how do you find the prisoner?
Guilty. Guilty.
Guilty. Guilty.
Guilty.
Guilty.
The sentence to be carried out this very night is death by burning.
No! No! Cannot do it! The body must stay in one piece.
Let him repent his idolatry and be baptized a Christian. He will receive the customary mercy.
Strangling instead.
You must do it. You must be baptized. You cannot let your body burn to ashes.
There must be something left.
Some flesh left for your father to warm alive at dawn.
I baptize you Juan de Atahualpa in honor of Juan the Baptist, whose sacred day this is.
The 29th day of August, 1533.
And may our Lord and his angels receive your soul with joy.
Amen.
So the brutal death of Atahualpa seemed to call for some uprising by the Incas. By this time in Cusco, Manco Inca, Pizarro's puppet Inca, saw his empire crumbling fast. Many of his own people did not accept him as Inca emperor. In addition, the Spaniards in Cusco under Pizarro brothers Juan and Gonzalo extorted gold from the Inca noblemen and raped the Inca women. They also stole Manco's own property and captured his wife, murdering her in 1539. Manco began an Inca rebellion, building a 100,000 soldier-strong army to remove the Spanish from Cusco. He quickly overtook the fortress of Sacsayhuaman above Cusco, putting the former Inca capital under siege in 1536. The Spaniards attacked the massive Inca army in the fortress. Fiery stones from Inca slingshots rained down on Cusco, burning the buildings. Francisco's brother Juan, while attacking Sacsayhuaman, was killed. During 10 months of siege, Spanish heads and limbs were chopped off by Inca troops, and Inca prisoners were impaled by Spanish swords or had their hands chopped off in Cusco's square by Spanish soldiers. Manco Capac had to flee the area of Cusco in 1537 to another fortress, Ollantaytambo. Here, Manco Inca diverted the nearby river to flood the plains where the Spanish cavalry was advancing, thus stopping the Spanish cavalry. The conquistadors beat a hasty retreat, but the tide turned as the Spanish army received reinforcements. Manco Inca now had to flee to the jungle valley of Vilcanota. The Spaniards gave chase but were too busy looting temples along the way that they got lost. Manco created an Inca government in exile in the jungle and rallied his Inca army. However, in 1544, Manco spared a small group of captured Spaniards who he thought were trustworthy, but they promptly turned on him, wanting to become famous for removing Manco Inca. These Spaniards killed him. Manco's son, Titu Cusi, now became the Inca and kept the Inca troops in the jungle. But the Spanish knew as long as there was a royal Inca leader around, there would be continued Inca uprisings. In 1569, two Augustinian friars came to the jungle to convert Titu Cusi to Christianity. By 1570, one friar had become a close companion to Titu Cusi. When Titu became ill, the good friar prepared a healing potion to cure him. Instead, the Inca died soon after drinking the potion. The enraged Inca troops immediately killed the friar. The other friar was dragged along the ground by the Inca soldiers with a rope cut through a hole cut behind his jaw. Then they finished him off with a blow to the head. This gave the Spaniards a reason to invade Vilcabamba. They gathered a large force to attack the new Inca Tupac Amaru, who put up a good defense. He escaped and headed deeper into the jungle. He floated downriver 170 miles and walked 55 miles more into the jungle. But the Spanish army captured Tupac Amaru and took him back to Cusco. The Spaniards also took and destroyed the mummies of Manco Inca and Titu Cusi. On Cusco's plaza, on September 21st, 1572, in front of 15,000 of his followers, Tupac Amaru was beheaded. It was 40 years after his uncle Atahualpa was captured by Pizarro. And that would have been the last of the Incas. But over 200 years later, Tupac Amaru's memory lived on. In 1780, Jose Gabriel Condorcanqui, who called himself Tupac Amaru II and claimed to be a descendant of the original Tupac Amaru, led an indigenous uprising against the Spanish viceroyalty in Peru. Condorcanqui's rebellion emerged due to the Spanish crown's increase of taxation on the indigenous population. Tupac Amaru II's rebellion built an army of over 6,000 indigenous people who tried to reinstate the Inca Empire. They marched on Cusco but were repulsed by the Spanish viceroy's troops. Tupac Amaru II was captured and beheaded in Cusco May 18, 1781, much like his distant relative. This was the last of the Incas. Colonial Lima and the Spanish viceroys. Here we're going to continue with Peru's history during the time of the Spanish viceroys. We recall that Lima sits along the Rimac River. Remember, that's how it came to be called Lima, a corruption of the pronunciation of Rimac. The city of the kings just was not a very catchy name. Lima was for nearly 300 years the capital of the Spanish viceroyalty of Peru. At one time, it encompassed nearly all of current Spanish-speaking South America, all the colored areas on this map. Carlos V, the King of Spain, set up the viceroyalty of Peru, and as head of the Catholic Church of Spain, he also set up the Spanish Inquisition in Lima. The viceroyalty of Peru was later divided into the viceroyalty of Nueva Granada in northern South America, and in southern South America, it was divided into the viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata. The Plaza de Armas is the center of the historic colonial district. During the colonial era, Peru was considered the most valuable Spanish position in the Americas because it produced vast quantities of silver and other metals for Europe. In its over 500-year history, the Plaza de Armas has seen all important events of Peru. In 1538, the first bullfight in Lima was held on the plaza. The center of the plaza originally had the city gallows in the center. but Spanish viceroy had this centerpiece replaced by a fountain in 1578. Spanish historian Bernabé Cobo said of the plaza, "It is the finest and most well-formed plaza that I have ever seen, even in Spain." The Spanish king instructed the viceroy to improve relations between the Spanish-born peninsulares and the indigenous peoples. This included elimination of the encomendero system, which treated the native people much like serfs in the Middle Ages, and also to remove the old Inca Mita system of labor taxes on workers. At the start of the 18th century, Inca had become an aristocratic and sophisticated colonial capital. Napoleon of France invaded the Iberian Peninsula in 1808 and upended the Spanish Empire. Napoleon removed Spain's King Ferdinand VII from the throne and put his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne. In Spanish America, independence movements began since Spain had no legitimate monarch. In 1821, Argentine General José de San Martín proclaimed the independence of Peru on the Plaza de Armas, after which the flag of the new republic was paraded around the plaza. The government palace is the official residence and office of Peru's president. It faces San Cristobal Hill, the city's highest point. It also forms one side of the Plaza de Armas. In the previous building on this site, this is where Pizarro was killed by Almagro supporters here in 1541. Over the years, the Cathedral of Lima has had numerous repairs made due to earthquake damage and several expansions. So by the 17th century, Lima had an immense Baroque Catholic cathedral reflecting the importance of the church in Spain's colony. The front of the cathedral has detailed carvings, plus a very large but seldom used wooden door. It has a smaller door to actually allow people in. Lima's cathedral has checkerboard flooring, an amazing gold-plated main altar, and wooden choir stalls with detailed carvings of saints and apostles. The tomb of Francisco Pizarro is near the cathedral's entrance. This shows the beautiful vaulted ceiling in the cathedral. Pope John Paul II visited this cathedral twice in 1985 and 1988. You can't walk around downtown Lima more than just a few blocks without stumbling upon another colonial church. At Lima's founding, the Catholic Church was allotted numerous parcels of land to build churches, convents, and monasteries in honor of patron saints. This church and convent are dedicated to St. Francis of Assisi near the Lima Cathedral. The Church of San Francisco, completed in 1774, is one of the best preserved of all of Lima's churches. It represents one of the most impressive monuments to colonial architecture in all of Latin America. You'll recognize San Francisco Church easily by the swarm of pigeons on the patio out front. Vendors sell bags of seed here to passersby to keep the birds coming. Built in the Baroque style of the late 1600s, San Francisco has several gilded side altars, a Moorish dome over the main staircase, small ornate chapels, and small patios with beautiful tiles that make you think you're in Seville. Here are a beautifully carved wooden pulpit and a gold altar at the Church of San Francisco. And here's the stunning library inside the convent of San Francisco. It has over 25,000 volumes. Following may be the most impressive part of the Church of San Francisco. It's certainly unique, but it may not be the best thing for the claustrophobic or anyone who is just a little bit squeamish. It is the San Francisco Church's famous catacombs in the basement underneath the church. The catacombs were actually part of Lima's original cemeteries built under churches. There are an estimated 75,000 bodies buried under San Francisco alone. Many of the remains are exposed, stacked in strange patterns and stone pits here at the catacombs underneath San Francisco. The Parque de la Muralla. During the 17th century, the heart of Lima was ringed by a muralla, a city wall, which was torn down as the city expanded. In 2002, it was turned into a park with games for kids, views of the river, pedestrian walkways, etc. The park is probably the only place in Peru that you will find a statue of Francisco Pizarro, the founder of Lima. It was donated to the city of Lima and installed in the Plaza de Armas on top of a tall pedestal near the cathedral for Lima's 400th anniversary on January 18, 1935. In 1952, Lima's archbishop complained that the rear end of the conquistador's horse was pointing directly at the church. So the statue was moved to a small corner just off the plaza. Then in 2002, there were complaints again about the Pizarro's oppression of the indigenous people. So it was moved in 2002 to this new park about a quarter mile away. But now it seems that this sculpture is not even a representation of Pizarro, but rather it is a generic Spanish medieval knight from a couple hundred centuries before the Spanish conquest of the Incas. And it seems that the statue had first been offered to Mexico as a statue of Hernan Cortes, conqueror of the Aztecs. And then when Mexico said no gracias, it was palmed off on Peru as Pizarro. The tall pedestal of the original statue is now gone. The statue is nearly at ground level, so children can play on it. You could say Pizarro is not put on a pedestal anymore, and he's relegated to an out-of-the-way spot in the city that he founded now almost 500 years ago.